Let's walk through some different aspects of natural language interfaces in order to come up with a working definition of what a natural language interface is. It's important to keep an open mind so that when you hear natural language interface, you don't assume chatbot. First of all, a natural language interface is all about interaction. You could interact with software like a website or hardware like a robot. The word language in natural language interface can actually have a few different meanings. At one end of the spectrum, you have natural language that is just whatever you think of off the top of your head and however you speak it. Then at the total other end of the spectrum is a completely structured command syntax. But natural language interfaces can fall anywhere in between. You might have some interfaces where the language is natural language, but in a controlled domain. Or you might have a sub-language that accepts certain kinds of input and not others. And then you might have a restricted language that only knows a couple of key phrases or commands. Natural language interface doesn't only have to mean say whatever you want, all input accepted. There can be different levels of natural to natural language interfaces, and that's okay. It's important to keep an open mind with respect to the medium or the format that the interaction can happen in. You might have audio input where you're speaking or listening, or text where you're typing. There might be times when you would just use tab complete or a menu select, but it still might be natural language. You might be assembling natural language sentences or phrases and commands in nodes in like a graphical tool. Natural language could also include sign language or body language. A natural language interface might only accept input from the user, or a natural language interface might only have output to the users, or you might have a dialogue where the input's coming from the user and the output's coming back to the user, and then the next turn of the dialogue keeps the previous turns in memory for understanding. A natural language interface might be controlled or initiated by the user, but there might be also some natural language interfaces that are activated automatically, triggered automatically, and there might be some interfaces where that control goes back and forth. The interaction might happen synchronously. It might be that you type in a command and then immediately there's a response from the system, or the timing might be asynchronous. There might be a delay. If you give an input, the response by the system might not happen till sometime later. Finally, when we consider what is the user trying to accomplish or why is the user interacting with this interface, it might be because they're trying to give commands to an Internet of Things device or give an instruction to a system. It might also be that the user is trying to explore an idea, maybe asking questions based on a knowledge base. Maybe they are fleshing out invention ideas, so they're putting in ideas to the system and the system is generating extensions of those ideas. Or it might just be for entertainment. Tell me a joke. Here's a definition that collects together all of the things from the previous slides. A natural language interface enables a user to achieve a goal by interacting with systems using natural language in a variety of formats. A natural language interaction might be initiated by the user or the system, and the interaction can flow like a conversation or be simple input or output in real time or delayed. This doesn't have to be the only definition of what a natural language interface is, but keeping in mind all those different aspects will help you from falling into the trap of assuming that every natural language interface is a chatbot. Let's talk motivation. When and why would you want to build a natural language interface? Let's start with an example. My parents have a TV remote that has a voice interface. So they can just press the button to turn on the microphone and say the name of the show they want to watch or the episode that they want to watch. They love this feature. Of course, they could use the on-screen menu to get to the show they want, but it's really tedious. The way you navigate these menus is you have to go to the menu and then go up, 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 and then over, 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 and then down, 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 and select the channel, and then again up, 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 and over, over, over to select the particular episode. It's very tedious. It's not that they don't understand how the menu works. It's not that they're confused about how the menu works. It's just way easier to use the voice interface. That's a great use case for a natural language interface. Another use case that comes up frequently is times when you might have your hands full and you need to give input to a machine or some software. Voice interface there makes perfect sense. eyes-free is an interesting kind of use case. In that case, imagine you might be cooking on the stove and you're paying attention to the hot stove and the food that you're working with, and you don't want to turn and look at a recipe. There again, a voice interface using natural language interaction could be really useful. One thing to point out about hands-free and eyes-free use cases is that just because you're not having to look at a device to interact with it, and just because you're not having to type on a device to interact with it, doesn't mean there's no distraction or cognitive load associated with that interaction. So hands-free and eyes-free interaction might not be safe when you are, for example, driving a car. So using speakerphone can sometimes be just as distracting as trying to hold a cell phone up to your ear. It's not about the physical device at that point. It's about being distracted by the conversation you're having. So when we talk about applications of natural language interfaces for the purposes of safety, be aware that there are other considerations. Another use case where natural language interfaces can be useful is when a user is trying to navigate an unfamiliar domain. If you are trying to do a search and you don't know exactly the right terminology to use, natural language queries where you can say, I'm looking for something that's like this, but different because ABC, that kind of natural language interface can allow you to stumble your way towards what you're looking for, even when you don't know the correct terminology. Now, here's something I want to caution against. Sometimes you'll hear people suggesting that a natural language interface can make a confusing existing user interface less confusing. I'm not sure that's always true. If the reason users are confused by a graphical user interface is because the design of the user interface doesn't match the user's mental model, and the design of the user interface doesn't translate well or map well to the tasks the user is trying to perform with that interface, adding a natural language interface is not going to make it less confusing. On a related note, there is a lot of research looking at translating natural language queries to structured query, like SQL, to query databases. This task is actually a lot harder than it seems at first. It can be quite easy to do proof of concept demos with simple queries and you think you're making really good progress. But when you're trying to do inner joins and subqueries and temporary tables and merging tables, the SQL syntax can become quite complex and the task becomes extremely challenging. At this point, you might consider, instead of trying to make your natural language to SQL translation solution more complex, it's worthwhile considering restructuring your tables so that the structure of the tables matches the kinds of queries you're running against those tables. Also, I would even suggest that SQL syntax is not necessarily that difficult to learn. There might be times where it's actually better to help your user assemble an SQL query that they can see and then run that query rather than hiding away the underlying SQL. So the takeaway here is that we don't want to build natural language interfaces just because they're a fashionable thing to do now. We want to look for use cases where a natural language interface actually makes the user experience better. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the history of natural language interfaces. This summary of the state of the art was taken from a panel discussion, and you can see here lots of valid points about advantages of natural language interfaces and disadvantages of natural language interfaces. This looks pretty good, right? So what if I told you that this actually came from a panel discussion in 1982? Researchers have been studying natural language interfaces and how people interact with these systems for a long time. A lot is already known, a lot has already been tried, and so whenever you're beginning work on a natural language interface project, it's worth your while to go and look and see what has been tried before and how did we get here. Now you might be wondering, if people have been studying natural language interfaces for so long, why aren't natural language interfaces everywhere? And the answer is because there were some technical challenges that until now were just really difficult to overcome. Here are some pictures taken from academic papers published in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. I'm not going to get into the specifics of each of the examples, but the images could give you a sense for how complex the approaches were to teasing apart the meaning of natural language input and translating it into something concrete that a machine can execute. So natural language input would come in and they would use dictionaries to identify key words and entities. They would identify part of speech. They would have routines that would pull apart the grammar and try to interpret the semantics of what was being said. And then, of course, they would have to implement special handling of cases where words are left out or certain words are referring to previously mentioned things. So, for example, if I said, I took my dog to the vet, he wasn't feeling well. When I say he, do I mean the dog or the vet? And my friend might reply saying, how did it go? And by it, they mean the trip to the vet. So when we're talking about natural language interfaces, natural language can be vague and messy, and the effort using traditional natural language processing techniques of mapping that to something that a machine can execute was just really hard. Now here's some pictures from papers that are a little bit more recent. The emphasis in the last 20 years has been more towards chatbots. There's still the same struggles with parsing the input and mapping it to the different semantic meaning, but you're also seeing now dialogue controlling mechanisms and so on. Libraries for performing the NLP tasks, they're more available, easier to access. So performing those NLP techniques are a little bit easier, but the challenge of translating from natural language input to something a machine can execute remained really difficult. That's why large language models really offer a breakthrough in building natural language interfaces. Understanding this history of natural language interfaces research is important because when you begin a new natural language interface project today, it's absolutely worthwhile to see what has been tried before and what we already know. That can save you a lot of time.